American Top 40.
Now, we're up to the new number one song, St. Elmo's Fire from the movie St. Elmo's Fire. Now, the song's subtitle is Man in Motion, and it was literally a man in motion in a wheelchair who inspired it. Singer and lyricist John Parr says that he heard about a man who's currently traveling around the world, pushing himself in a wheelchair. And John says, I was so overflowing with feeling about what he was doing, the lyric came to me instantly. I think it's very uplifting, not only for someone in his position, but for anyone at all. End of quote. The man in the wheelchair is Canadian Rick Hansen. When Rick was 18, he was in an auto accident that left him unable to use his legs. That slowed him down, but it sure didn't stop him. He became a paraplegic athlete competing in wheelchair races. Now, Rick is 28 years old, and he's attempting something that's never been done before, traveling around the world in a wheelchair under his own power. Rick began his wheelchair odyssey in Vancouver, British Columbia, wheeling himself down the west coast through Washington, Oregon, and California. Then he flew to Ireland. He figures the whole journey will take about 18 months. He hopes to finish back in Canada, in Vancouver, at the 1986 World's Fair. He was last seen in Europe, near Paris. Rick calls his global trip the Man in Motion World Tour. That's where John Parr took the subtitle for the song he wrote with David Foster, a song that this week is the number one song in the USA. The new number one song, John Parr's title song from the movie St. Elmo's Fire, subtitle Man in Motion. The new number one song in the land, John Parr and St. Elmo's Fire, subtitle Man in Motion. It's from the St. Elmo's Fire soundtrack.
American Top 40.
Here's the number one song that was inspired by a Canadian paraplegic athlete named Rick Hansen, who's wheeling himself around the world in a wheelchair, calling his journey the Man in Motion Tour. At last report, Rick was in Tel Aviv, Israel, headed for Copenhagen, Denmark, and then New Zealand. His final stop will be Vancouver, British Columbia in Canada at the 1986 World's Expo. The hit he inspired is by John Parr, and it's the 18th most popular song of the year. Here's St. Elmo's Fire, subtitled Man in Motion. That's John Parr from England with St. Elmo's Fire, Man in Motion, at number 16 in our year-end survey.
Casey's Coast to Coast.
Now, the final chapter in our continuing story about the Man in Motion. You see, a few years ago, singer John Parr hit number one with the song St. Elmo's Fire, subtitled Man in Motion, a song inspired by a man who began a trip around the world pushing himself in a wheelchair. He's Canadian Rick Hansen, and for the last couple of years, we've been keeping track of Rick's progress. When he was 18, he was in an auto accident that left him unable to use his legs. Now, that slowed him down, but it sure didn't stop him. He became a paraplegic athlete competing in wheelchair races. In 1985, when Rick was 28, he decided to attempt something that's never been done before. Travel around the world in a wheelchair under his own power. He called it the Man in Motion Tour. Rick began his wheelchair odyssey in Vancouver, British Columbia. He wheeled himself down the Pacific coast to California, then flew to Ireland. He then rolled through Europe. He's seen the Blue Danube in Vienna, met with the Pope in Rome, and wheeled through the ancient Acropolis in Athens and through the holy city of Jerusalem. Then he wheeled through New Zealand and Australia, through the streets of Hong Kong to a hero's welcome at the Great Wall in China. Then Rick came back to North America. He went from Florida up the East Coast and then wheeled west across Canada. On May 22, 1987, 2 years and 2 months later, Rick Hansen wheeled himself into Vancouver. He had gone a total of 25,000 miles, covering 34 countries and 4 continents. He also raised $21 million for spinal cord research. Rick now lives in Vancouver, but he's still traveling all over the world, now mostly by plane, continuing his fundraising. As an AT40 extra, here's the song that singer John Parr co-wrote with David Foster about the Man in Motion, Rick Hansen. A number one one song back in 1985, St. Elmo's Fire, Man in Motion by John Parr. It was inspired by Rick Hansen, the real-life man in motion who traveled around the world in a wheelchair.
The hits from coast to coast.